Well, the big news of the night is that Special Prosecutor Jack Smith has subpoenaed Donald Trump's final White House Chief of Staff, Mark Meadows, to testify under oath to a grand jury in Washington, D.C. CNN's reporting tonight that Mark Meadows received a subpoena sometime in January seeking documents and testimony related to the January 6th attack on the Capitol by a Trump mob encouraged by Donald Trump. An attorney for Meadows declined to comment on that report. Mark Meadows also has relevant information for a separate investigation led by Special Prosecutor Jack Smith into Donald Trump's illegal possession and handling of government documents after leaving the White House. If Mark Meadows has not yet been subpoenaed to testify to the grand jury investigating the documents case, then tonight's news may be an indication that Jack Smith's January 6th investigation might be moving closer to a conclusion than the documents investigation. Mark Meadows refused to comply with a subpoena by the January 6th committee in the House of Representatives. A member of that committee, Congressman Adam Schiff, will join us to discuss what the committee wanted to question Mark Meadows about and what Jack Smith should be questioning Mark Meadows about. At a campaign event in Minnesota today for Mike Pence's not yet announced losing presidential campaign, Mike Pence made it official that he received a subpoena from Jack Smith last week, and he intends to fight it for the most preposterous reason ever given by a former vice president of the United States for anything.
Well, I'm going to fight the Biden's DOJ on the subpoena that was sent to me last week because it's unconstitutional and it's unprecedented. And the DOJ knows that. The subpoena by the Justice Department's special counsel actually runs contrary to what the Department of Justice actually argued on my behalf in 2 different cases in the last 2 years. Literally, the Department of Justice in the last 2 years made the case, excuse me, that I, as vice president, was covered by the speech and debate clause. And now we receive a subpoena in direct violation of that. So we'll stand on that principle.
You'll be hearing a lot about the case Mike Pence was just talking about. The case he's referring to was filed by a man in Utah named Roland Brunson, who pleaded that case himself without a lawyer, suing 385 members of the House and Senate, along with President Biden, Vice President Kamala Harris, and former Vice President Mike Pence. The case was promptly dismissed by the federal district court in Utah. Mr. Brunson then appealed the case to the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals, who unanimously affirmed the dismissal of the case for lack of jurisdiction and failure to state a claim. The appeals court said the lawsuit was frivolous. The U.S. Attorney's Office in Utah filed a successful motion for dismissal of the case at the very beginning of the case, which, among several other arguments which did prevail, mentioned the speech and debate clause of the Constitution in defense of, quote, claims against the defendant members of Congress and former Vice President Pence concerning their accepting the Electoral College votes during one of the most important functions of Congress. The Utah U.S. Attorney's Office said in that pleading that while the vice president and the members of Congress were engaged inside the Capitol in certifying the votes of the Electoral College, their actions were protected by, quote, absolute legislative immunity under the speech or debate clause of the Constitution. The dismissal of the case and the appeals court affirming the dismissal of the case was not based in any way on the speech and debate clause of the Constitution. The courts ignored that argument, completely ignored that argument, and paid attention to other elements of the case. So no court has ever ruled on whether the speech and debate clause in any way protects the vice president of the United States for anything at any time. Now, I know I read for you the entirety of the speech and debate clause of the Constitution last night, but it's worth repeating at least one more time tonight because you are going to be hearing a lot about it while Mike Pence is conducting this ridiculous fight. And most of what you will hear about it will probably be wrong. It says in its entirety, once again, the senators and representatives shall receive a compensation for their services to be ascertained by law and paid out of the Treasury of the United States. They shall, in all cases except treason, felony, and breach of the peace, be privileged from arrest during their attendance at the session of their respective houses and in going to and returning from the same, and for any speech or debate in either house, they shall not be questioned in any other place. So it clearly applies only to speech in the House or in the Senate, speech in the Capitol, speech or debate in either house shall not be questioned. But the truly controlling language of the speech and debate clause are the very first words, the senators and representatives shall. That's it. They are the only beneficiaries of the speech and debate clause. Mike Pence never was a senator, and no court will ever be able to legitimately claim that the word senators in the speech and debate clause applies to the Vice President of the United States. The authors of the Constitution knew in another clause of the Constitution they were creating a vice president. They could have easily begun the speech and debate clause with the words, the vice president, the senators, and the representatives shall. But they very consciously did not include the vice president in this clause. All senators have rights that the vice president does not have. All senators have the right to vote on everything that comes before the United States Senate and comes before committees of the United States Senate. The vice president only has the right to vote to break a tie in the Senate chamber and has no right to ever vote in a committee, which means the vice president has a right to vote in the Senate less than 1% of the time. All senators can introduce legislation in the Senate. All senators can introduce amendments to legislation. The vice president can never do any of that. All senators are members of committee. The vice president is not allowed to be a member of any Senate committee. All senators are sworn in with an oath of office administered in the Senate chamber. The vice president of the United States takes the oath of office on Inauguration Day with the president of the United States. We have had 49 vice presidents of the United States. Exactly one of them has received a subpoena from a grand jury investigating possible crimes committed by the president that vice president served. Mike Pence is telling the lie tonight that the authors of the Constitution believed that he should never be compelled to give testimony about crimes he witnessed in the White House. Mike Pence is obviously doing this because, like most politicians, he is the very last to realize that he will never win an election again. And so he will continue to degrade and disgrace himself in pursuit of the votes of the people who literally wanted him dead on January 6th.